This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 537 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I thought I was going to open up today's show by talking about the Travis Etienne injury and what it means for the Jacksonville backfield. And then Sony Michel was traded to the Rams. So today's open is going to be about both of those news items. And I'm dropping this episode early, one day early, so that you all have this information for any draft that you're going to be doing. Let's start with that Jacksonville backfield. When it was announced that Travis Etienne would be out for the season, the initial thought for many was that James Robinson would be a bell cow. He would be a locked-in low-end RB1, maybe a high-end RB2. I saw the tweets. I saw what people were thinking. And as much as I love James Robinson, the player, and what he did for my wallet last year, I need to stay objective with this. There are three big things working against Robinson that make this a little bit more complicated than just saying, hey, he was easily a top 10 back last year, so he should probably be one this year with a better quarterback, right? The first thing is the coaching staff. I've said all offseason that my biggest concern with Travis Etienne, despite absolutely loving him at cost, was the fact that I don't know if the coaching staff is very sharp. The fact that they had James Robinson on their roster, that they're in rebuild mode, and they went out and drafted Travis Etienne with a first-round selection, that's not all that encouraging. They drafted a luxury position when they probably shouldn't have. That means that I just don't know if they'll be rational with how they divvy up that backfield. Carlos Hyde is there. And as much as we want to roll our eyes when we hear that name, Hyde's better than anything Robinson competed against last year in that backfield. And Hyde's already played with the first team in the preseason. Now, to that point, and the second thing I want to talk about is that we can't forget that a huge reason James Robinson was able to do what he did last year was because of his insanely high backfield share. Among all backs to play at least 8 games since 2011, Robinson's rush share per game rate last year ranks first. Using that same threshold of games played for running back rush share, not total rush share, that was also first. We can't expect that to continue with a new coaching staff and a better piece in that backfield in Carlos Hyde. And then on top of all that, the third reason that James Robinson won't just be a top 10 running back again is because the competition at the running back position across fantasy football is stronger. It's better this year. We have healthier running backs right now. That's why I think Robinson is more in the David Montgomery tier than like the Joe Mixon tier. I have him at RB19. But it's a really good example of not just assuming a player will get better because his offense will be better. There's more to a situation than just that. Now let's move on to this Sony Michel trade. I talked on Monday about how Darrell Henderson was moving up my rankings a bit, and how he was becoming a little bit easier to draft, mostly from a game theory perspective. The ceiling was technically there. I still think that process was fine. And I'm not one of those people who think Henderson is a bad running back. But this is a really good example of how fragile these dead zone running backs really are. The reason I didn't push Henderson higher than that RB21 spot was because something like this was always a possibility. Henderson wasn't a locked-in bell cow like we see from 15 other running backs in fantasy football this year. When the player himself is more questionable, or the way a team views that player may be up in the air, that brings fragility. This is part of the reason the running back dead zone even exists. Which, by the way, if you want to learn more about the running back dead zone, listen to episode 514. Henderson dropped to RB27 in my rankings with this Sony Michel news. I think it matters for Henderson's projection. I don't understand how some people think that this is irrelevant to Darrell Henderson. It's not irrelevant. Usually anytime there's some piece added to a backfield, it's bad for the other players in that backfield. Sony Michel hasn't been able to stay healthy in the NFL. But get this, according to Next Gen Stats, Sony Michel was first in rushing yards over expectation per attempt last year among running backs with 50 or more carries. The fear for Henderson is that he won't be the goal line back in that offense. And that's a big deal because not only do we just want touchdowns, but the Rams are going to be good offensively. And over the last couple of seasons, even without Todd Gurley being peak Todd Gurley, only the Ravens and Patriots have run the ball at a higher rate at the goal line than the Los Angeles Rams have. It wouldn't shock me if Sony Michel is utilized pretty heavily in this offense. That's certainly in the range of outcomes here. And we should be open-minded to that. There's just an insanely wide range of outcomes in this situation right now. Just embrace that. Understand that exists. You don't have to firmly take one side or the other. I have Michel at RB31 right now. But as you know, the ambiguous RB1 theory would definitely favor Darrell Henderson if both of their ADPs end up in round 6 through 9. And if Henderson is the RB1 by ADP. So if we see these ADPs get tighter, Henderson, at least based on history, could become a pretty nice value. And for the record, just because a running back fits the ambiguous RB1 theory doesn't mean you should automatically draft him. It's just a trend, nothing more. But I will say this, there's a chance I end up liking Henderson more now than I did before. If his ADP drops significantly, then his opportunity cost is a lot lower. His ceiling may not be as high, but it could still be pretty high as the 1A in the Rams backfield, if that's the way things sort of work out. But right now, I'm sorry, I just can't be more firm with the situation and how I feel about it. I've shared my general thoughts, but I'm not going to sit here and record this and just be a hot take machine. We need more information about Henderson's thumb injury. More importantly, we need more information on what the market is going to do. Until then, it's hard to say, yes, I'm all in on Darrell Henderson. Because if his ADP is still at like RB23, I'm probably not going to be all in. So my answer to this is use my rankings as a general guide and just sort of go from there. Now, I want to talk about Damien Harris here too. I sent some tweets about Harris after that trade went down because I've just been surprised by how many people are so in love with Damien Harris this year. I've mentioned this before on the show, but I just don't really see it. Like, yeah, I understand how he can get there. He can score a lot of touchdowns. New England likes to run it close to their opponent's end zone. I just talked about that. But banking on touchdowns like that is not the best strategy. Damien Harris still needs to see an uptick in receiving for me to feel more comfortable. And I don't know if he's going to see that. Because we have a lot of evidence pointing to him not seeing a ton of work through the air. That evidence being the New England backfield history under this coaching staff. Since 2011, the Patriots have had 4 running backs with 200 or more carries. The highest single season target share among those backs was 3.4%. 3.4%. That's tiny. Now, why is that the case? Because New England uses their running backs in specialized roles. James White had almost a 15% target share last year, and he's still on the team. Over the last decade, we've had 200 top 20 running backs in fantasy football. Top 20 running backs, 10 years, 10 times 20, 200. So I'm not talking about top 10 running backs. I'm not talking about super elite players at the position. I'm talking about RB2s here. Of those 200 backs, only 9 of them had a target share below 5%. Now, this is all focused on PPR formats, but a lot of you are drafting in PPR, and my analysis focuses on PPR to keep things standardized. I would worry a lot about Damien Harris's true ceiling. In a best ball draft, he's fine. He's going to get touches this year, and you don't have to predict when you should use him. My educated guess, though, is that he's going to end up being one of those 200 plus attempt backs with a sub 5% target share in the New England offense. We've seen this play out before. But where's the room for growth? You absolutely need him to see significantly more targets. Or he needs to find the end zone a lot. And by a lot, I'm talking like 14 times at a minimum. As long as he's not going to see more targets, he needs to find the end zone that much more. Now, to me, I'm more interested in getting a wide receiver where Damien Harris typically goes. And then I'll get that wide receiver, and I'm just going to draft Gus Edwards later. And that might be potentially significantly later now because Harris's ADP is probably going to rise a little bit. The bottom line between Edwards and Damien Harris, both players are going to score points in a similar way. Edwards has Dobbins and Lamar Jackson to deal with, but the Ravens' offense is likely going to be a lot better than New England's. And then people will say, well, what's Edwards' upside though? I mean, his upside is crazy if J.K. Dobbins gets hurt. He's a flex play with that upside. He's not a traditional handcuff. There really isn't an injury in the New England backfield that's going to help Damien Harris, at least more than likely. Even if James White gets hurt, they might just throw J.J. Taylor in the backfield. J.J. Taylor is not a bad late round dart throw, by the way. Not just because his name is elite. So again, I don't know where Harris's ADP is going to land. I have him in that same range as Henderson and Michel, but a player like Henderson has a higher ceiling in my opinion. And that's why I have Darrell Henderson ranked ahead of Damian Harris. And you can honestly make the same argument for Sony Michel. And maybe my Harris stance will bite me in the butt, but I do think it's rational. I think it's the right process. So I can't be mad if it does. I can't be mad if Damian Harris does work out and I look foolish. I think the process is right. So no, I'm not going to have a lot of Damian Harris this year, and that's especially true if his ADP rises after this move. Now, today is a mailbag show, but before getting into the questions, the 2021 NFL season is right around the corner, and FanDuel is giving fans the opportunity to get in on the action by playing fantasy football. Right now, FanDuel has daily best ball fantasy drafts that you can compete in. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel.com and draft your team. Pick a league with your desired amount of teams, draft your squad, and compete for prizes. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. The first question this week is from @It'sThatBoy75. Is Marquez Callaway an underrated player, or are we overreacting to a good preseason game? Let's start this by saying that we usually don't see undrafted players make big impacts in fantasy football at the NFL level. There's usually a reason they were undrafted. But Callaway's profile is not terrible. He had below average marks in 2 of the 3 production metrics that I look at in my model, but he did have a pretty strong breakout age. And he wasn't an early declare. Those are the things that my model sees. Any undrafted player won't look good in my model. But to Callaway's credit, he's a pretty good undrafted player in that model. My stance with him is this. Are you really going to have to spend that much to get him? Likely not. I'm not going to fault anyone for getting Marquez Callaway. That would be silly. Recent drafts right now have him going in that wide receiver 60 range. So I'm cool if you want to go his way. It just depends on the type of league that you're in and your overall build. I just wouldn't get overconfident. Like, Jacoby Myers is a far better selection in my opinion than Marquez Callaway. He's an undrafted wide receiver as well, but he had a better prospect score in my model, and he also has a history. Just last year, he had a high target share in that New England offense. I don't see why his ceiling isn't just as high as Callaway's while also having a higher floor. And he doesn't have one of the better wide receivers in football coming back mid-season or potentially coming back mid-season. Michael Thomas is going to be the alpha in that offense when he returns. Like, if Michael Thomas is back, are you going to feel that confident playing Marquez Callaway? Maybe you will, but I think probability is on the side of you probably won't. So it all just depends. I think it's fine if you want to target him in drafts, and I've done so myself. But there are players in that range who I still prefer, like Jacoby Myers or maybe Terrace Marshall. That doesn't mean I'm not getting Callaway. It just means that I don't think he's just this obvious slam dunk pick. This next question is from @MountainManMT. Are you still on team late round QB? Has the arrival of elite rushing quarterbacks in the NFL changed your strategy at quarterback? So with this question, I'm going to direct you to 2 separate pieces that should help clarify my overall stance, at least in more detail. The first is an episode on the Late Round podcast that I did earlier this offseason on the importance of quarterback rushing. That's episode 472. The other is an article on NumberFire called, Is the Late Round Quarterback Strategy Dead? You can Google that title with the word NumberFire and it should pop up. Those 2 pieces explain why in today's game in 2021's fantasy football season, it's a lot easier to get an elite quarterback versus other seasons. I felt similarly last year before the season started, and I talked about that. People were and still are finally valuing quarterback rushing the way they should value it. Now, the question of, am I still on team late round QB? Yes, of course. Just not as hardcore as I have been over the last 10 years since I started doing all of this. I think we're going to get to a point in fantasy football where there are legitimately 12, 13, 14 options per season where those options have legit top 3 upside in fantasy football. That's where we were just 3 or 4 years ago. We're just not quite there yet because of the rushing component. Maybe it happens this year, but it's not as predictable. Historically, it's been a good idea to just avoid the middle round guys and go big or go home, and I usually just went home. But now you can pick off a stud if one falls. You can look at the next tier and you can get a guy like Jalen Hurts or Ryan Tannehill. Or you can just get one of the rookie quarterbacks. It's just a different year in general at quarterback. I think there's a very real chance that this is the year of the rookie quarterback, but regardless, whether it is or isn't, I know I still want a mobile quarterback. This next question is from @set_animal. How do you feel about the argument that it's bad draft strategy to bench your 5th or 6th round pick? I.e., if you take too many wide receivers at the top of the draft, are you wasting value because they can't all play in a given week? Thanks. No, this type of argument can be thrown in the trash. If that's the logic that we're using, then should we just be roster filling? Why are we taking backup running backs and wide receivers all the time over tight ends and defenses and kickers before we have starters at those positions? And even quarterbacks. Because we recognize value. And we recognize that there's value in having an abundance of running backs and wide receivers on our fantasy teams. Not all of your picks are going to work out. And even if they did, it's always good to have that value to utilize in a trade or just have in plus matchups. This idea of lineup filling is wrong. And if anyone's pushing that, they're being suboptimal. You'll almost never have the right lineup just fall right into your lap that way. This next question is from @ElderGoose4. I want to know why you project Chase Claypool over Deontay Johnson, even if they are only one ranking apart. Okay, so I have Claypool one spot ahead of Deontay Johnson this year in my fantasy rankings. That's what you just noted. I should say, though, this isn't how I have them projected. Deontay Johnson projects out to be better than Chase Claypool. The reason I have Claypool one spot ahead is because I typically am striving for ceiling. And I see Claypool as having that. I don't want to just reiterate the things that I said in the Players to Target show, so go back and listen to that. But I did talk about Chase Claypool on that show. I'm typically getting Chase Claypool as my wide receiver 3, given the builds that I typically construct. So shooting for that ceiling is a little bit easier for me to do. Even if he's your wide receiver 2, I'd still go for that ceiling. But if you want to go with Deontay Johnson, I have no problem whatsoever. He's a safer bet. And he's a safer bet to see a high target share specifically. Anyone who listened to this show last year knows that I'm a Deontay Johnson stan. So you won't hear an argument from me if you want to go with Deontay Johnson over Chase Claypool. It actually makes sense for a lot of builds. And this is also why I'm just not the biggest fan of rankings. Because I think there's context needed for almost every single player. This next question is an email. It says, JJ, we talk about prospect grades coming into the NFL, and for many years of watching college football, go Hawkeyes, I can't remember a quarterback over the last 10 years coming into the league with the tools and accomplishments as Trevor Lawrence has this year. No disrespect to Andrew Luck. Now, I feel his ADP is downright disrespectful, with others drafted after him viewed as better sleepers. I think the entire fantasy football community is asleep at the wheel here. Shoot, I'll stack a couple of his pass catchers even in redraft, dynasty no-brainer, with Lawrence and a late round vet. But really, why are we not all over Lawrence as a true sleeper? Sincerely, Neil from the best beach in Florida. I don't think this is all that wrong. We're all understandably enamored with Justin Fields and Trey Lance, but let's not forget that Trevor Lawrence can bring a little juice with his legs too. Let's not forget that he's the best prospect since Andrew Luck. Let's not forget that he was dominant in college, and he's now sitting in a situation with pretty decent personnel around him. I think it's just the fact that there are a lot of good quarterbacks who have a better ceiling in year one for Trevor Lawrence. Lawrence doesn't have quite the rushing ability that we're going to see from Justin Fields and Trey Lance. Or someone like Jalen Hurts. But look, I have no problem walking into week 1 with Trevor Lawrence as my fantasy football starter. Especially in a superflex format. And don't forget, Lawrence is going to face Houston in that week 1 game too. This last question is from @Mr_Get_Right. Who is a player that after a full season of frustrating research, ranking, adjusting, and readjusting, you still aren't sure what to expect from this upcoming season? I could go in a lot of different directions with this question, but I think the player I'm landing on most when thinking about this question is Brandon Ayuk. Because as I've said on this show, I love Ayuk the player. I think he fits the Shanahan offense really, really well. But there are a lot of things situationally that I don't like. The fact that he's likely going to have a rookie quarterback throwing him the ball. Historically, that hasn't been a good thing. And that rookie quarterback is mobile. That's also not a good thing. That there's pretty good competition there. That they're likely going to be run heavy given that schedule, and volume could be an issue. It's a talent versus situation dilemma, and I try not to fade talent. So I'm still drafting Ayuk in some spots. But the one thing I keep reminding myself is that where Ayuk is going, there are other talented players around him. It's not like if I pass on Brandon Ayuk, I'm drafting some scrub. I'm drafting a really good player as well. He's just been a tough evaluation for me this year. He hasn't been someone that I've just totally avoided, but he also hasn't been someone that I've heavily targeted because of the situational things that aren't in his favor. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Also, one quick thing before I let you go. The regular season, as you know, it's almost here. And as a result, I won't be able to be nearly as active with my email when it comes to these mailbag questions. If you guys could just hold off on sending emails for mailbag questions until after the season and just utilize Twitter, it would be greatly, greatly appreciated. And please don't be one of those people who spams my inbox with start-sit questions. I want to help as many people as I possibly can, I promise you. But there are avenues on social media to ask those questions, whether it's my Twitter account or my start-sit show every Sunday morning during the season. So I appreciate your understanding. I'm really excited to crush it this season with you guys, and I'm ready to win some fantasy football championships. Thanks as always for listening. Have a great weekend.